Hey, it's Nether. In this video I will share with you my Warrior Titan build I've been working on since the start of early access. I have received a bunch of requests from you guys for a warrior build guide, and here it is. This build utilizes a combination of Herald of Ice and Pulse Circle and Ring for massive AoE clear through shatters, which uses our weapon set 1 passives. For single target damage it stacks Bleed Chance and Bleed Magnitude. We use Hammer of the Gods for big bleeds. These bleeds are elevated further by breaking the target's armor with our totem and linking Exploit Weakness to our hammer. Single target uses the weapon set 2 passives. This build is somewhat solo cell-found friendly as it works on a budget version without using any crazy expensive or rare items. The build is designed for softcore, but with some modifications to make it more tanky at the cost of map clear, it has potential for hardcore too. If you plan to try it out and set it up on trade, expect to invest about 15 to 20 divines before it really starts popping off. The background footage demonstrates its powerful clear and decent bossing capabilities. In the first section of this guide, I will share some tips on how to effectively level up a warrior from scratch. After, I will explain about all of the interactions between skill gems and support gems the build uses. Then we move on to the build's passive tree and jewels, followed by gearing and endgame gear progression. Lastly, I will explain the gameplay mechanics, which map mods to be aware of, and how to play the build to your best ability. Before we start, we need to briefly discuss broken builds. There are some for Warrior too. There is a cheesy interaction you can use with Trample Toe unique boots, the boots that add overkill damage. And there's a bug with Shield Wall that essentially gives you infinite damage, which will enable you to pretty much one-shot absolutely everything in the game. To each their own, but I think you quickly get burned out and ruin the fun of the game if you turn it into an actual cookie clicker. I'm 100% confident that this will be removed from the game, but there are so many overpowered builds and interactions that GGG decided not to nerf anything in particular for the time being. The main goal of this build guide is to offer you something that lasts and won't be nerfed into the ground with the next big patch. Outside of Herald of Ice Shatter, I don't think anything this build uses will see nerfs. In fact, I'm pretty sure most of what we use will receive buffs instead. And even if Herald of Ice will be nerfed to a point where it's no longer usable, we can always switch back to using Armor Explosions for map clear instead, which is what we use for leveling. After creating your warrior, the first skill gem you want to pick up is Bone Shatter, which can be cut at level 1 from your very first skill gem. Your best early game attack combo is the default Mace Strike and Bone Shatter. Simply use a couple of Mace Strikes, and when the target is primed for stun, which is indicated by the glowing light orb, you use Bone Shatter to obliterate them into oblivion. Shield Charge should be used when available at level 6. Equip a shield in your second weapon set and a two-handed mace in your first weapon set. You can also use a one-handed mace if you have some leveling gear to help you out with damage. The faster attack speed of one-handed maces sets up primed for stun slightly quicker, which will obviously improve your clear. Two-handed maces on the other hand are better for bossing. Use both or use whatever you like, it doesn't really matter as long as you can kill stuff early on. Link Shield Charge with Ingenuity support for some cooldown reduction. Don't forget to dodge roll at the very end of the Shield Charge animation to cancel it slightly quicker. Prioritize linking Overpower to Mace Strike, and then later link it with Martial Tempo and Rage as you progress. On Bone Shatter, you want to prioritize linking Impact Shockwave, and then Magnified Effect and eventually Brutality. Around level 10, you'll get your first Spirit Gem. Cut it into Herald of Ash, and link it with Vitality and Cannibalism, or Clarity if you have mana issues. Once you have unlocked more Spirit through the campaign quest rewards. At level 22, you get access to Leap Slam, which will be your new way of priming targets for stun, on top of offering some mobility. Link Leap Slam with Inspiration first, Holy Descent afterwards, and Discombobulate as your third support. When you obtain a spare skill gem, cut that one into Infernal Cry. Use Infernal Cry in between attacks. Link it with Premeditation, Enraged War Cry, and Raging Cry. In level 35 plus areas, tier 2 support gems can start dropping, which is important as we need Armor Explosion support. A tier 2 support gem we want to link to Stampede. Once you hit level 41, Stampede can be used. This will be our main clear skill from now on. Link Stampede with Armor Explosion support and spec into Shattering Blow on the passive tree to emulate those juicy shatter explosions. After linking Armor Explosion, prioritize Martial Tempo, then Momentum support, Aftershock, and lastly Close Combat. We drop Bone Shatter altogether. Leap Slam can still help with stunning targets, but is mostly used as a mobility skill or a get out of jail card. Since good bleed damage requires a bunch of passive tree nodes that can only be reached at higher character levels, we want to opt in for Ignite damage instead. Perfect Strike will be our new single target skill and Ignite enabler. Prioritize linking Window of Opportunity, then Eternal Flame, Primal Armament, and lastly, Heavy Swing. Even though we can equip Pulse Circle and Ring at character level 12, we don't use it until we get into endgame. It is very difficult to run Herald of Ice on a warrior without any help from gear, because of its rather steep attribute requirements. The bare minimum to outperform armor explosions would be a level 10 plus Herald of Ice gem, which already requires 46 int and dex to be used. To consistently shatter with Pulse Circle and Ring, you need to deal significant amount of cold damage. In the endgame build, we use Cold Infusion on Stampede to achieve this, but at lower character levels, with a crappy weapon and gear, it is difficult to deal enough cold damage to reliably shatter, if you can even use Herald of Ice altogether, that is. Technically, you can already start shattering during the campaign with a lower level Herald of Ice, but it requires some pretty big boy gear. If you're trading, rich, and you can purchase an Astromantis amulet, or you already own one, nice. Use Herald of Ice and Pulse Circle and Ring as soon as you unlock Stampede. Astromantis can be equipped at level 24 and pretty much trivializes the entire campaign on any class and build. Refer to the endgame gem section of the video to see which support gems to link to Herald of Ice. Most of you probably don't have that amount of currency laying around. Don't worry about it. You will still have a good time in the campaign, pinky promise. At level 52 you get access to the undisputed best warrior skill, Hammer of the Gods, which will be your new single target damage. Most of the time, a single Hammer of the Gods is enough to deal with a boss or nasty rare monster. We keep Perfect Strike in the back to help out with single target damage when a single hammer doesn't do the trick. Prioritize linking Hammer with Fist of War, Brutality, Heavy Swing, and lastly Rage Forged. Use any working support to replace Heavy Swing on Perfect Strike. It doesn't really matter what you use. At level 58 you can drop one of your support gems linked to Herald of Ash to free up the spirit to use Berserk, which massively increases your damage gain from Rage. For those of you playing solo self-found, or starting with your first character, you might have limited access to uncut support gems, skill gems, and jeweler orbs. Prioritize gem links on Stampede, then Hammer of the Gods, and lastly Perfect Strike. Everything else comes after. Don't forget to use Gem Cutter Prisms to bring all of your skill gems to 20% quality. With all the leveling skills and gem links covered, it's time to talk a bit about leveling gear. Outside of a strong two-handed mace, attack speed and movement speed are your most important stats for leveling. Even more so on a warrior leveling with Stampede, because movement speed directly converts into skill speed, as Stampede is both an attack and a movement skill, with multiple instances of damage. The initial attack animation of Stampede scales with, you guessed it, attack speed, and the movement portion of the skill scales with movement speed. Both scale with skill speed. If this confuses you, don't worry, just know that attack speed and movement speed, good. Unfortunately, there's no good unique two-handed mace in the game yet that lasts you until maps.
Officer, I got one question for you. What are those?
So your best bet is to upgrade your mace every now and then. Make sure to check your vendors every time you level up, if your damage is falling off and you need a weapon upgrade. On leveling maces, you want to prioritize increased physical damage, added physical damage, other types of added flat damage, attack speed, and then anything else is a bonus. Physical damage builds up 50% more stun than other types of damage, which massively helps with proccing our armor explosion. Stat prioritization on armor, rings, and amulets, outside of movement speed on boots, are resistances, life, then added flat damage, attributes, and lastly mana leech. Once again, everything else is a bonus. Accuracy will never be an issue, as we rush Resolute Technique on our passive tree, which makes it so your hits can never be evaded at the cost of never dealing crits. Well, I guess accuracy will still be an issue when trying to Exalt Slam a GG item, but that's another story. The endgame build uses Giant's Blood to equip a shield while using a two-handed mace. This can be difficult to set up while you're still in the campaign or early maps, as it requires a big strength investment to use. The moment you get enough strength to use it, set it up immediately. Having a shield with good block chance and other nice stats is one of the few layers of defense the build uses, as we completely ignore armor. And if that comes as a surprise, well, I think you missed the memo. Armor is freaking useless in PoE 2 currently. Pretty much all of our endgame defenses come from stacking max resistances, life and block chance. There's no need for a separate passive skill tree for leveling, as the endgame skill tree is very similar to the leveling skill tree. I will explain which passives to take in which order and why in the passive tree section of this video. Following all of the prior advice should make the campaign a breeze on Warrior, but is by no means the only way to level up a warrior. If you're playing warrior for the first time, I highly encourage you to try out all of the skills and see if there's something you like using more. Progressing efficiently is nice, but making sure you have the most fun while doing so is way more important. You've made your way through the campaign, acquired some levels, and are now ready to transition into a winter warrior. As you can see, there are no support gems linked to Mace Strike, as we are not using it anymore. Leap Slam links did not change. We're still using Inspiration to lower the mana cost, Holy Descent for a massive 5% life regen ground effect, and Discombobulate to daze enemies. Daze lasts for 8 seconds, and a dazed enemy will take 50% more stun buildup. Berserk also stays the same, with Vitality linked for 1% life regen, and Clarity for 30% increased mana regen. Wait, another gem that helps with mana? Is that really necessary? Yes, when having a significant amount of plus level 2 gems, the mana cost quickly spirals out of control. For example, a single Stampede costs 200 mana at level 27, with plus 4 to melee skills coming from my weapon, and another plus 3 to Stampede coming from the Prism of Belief Diamond Jewel. More on this in the passive tree section. Moving on to our single target bread and butter, Hammer of the Gods. We link it with Fist of War, massively increasing its damage every 6 seconds, which essentially has no downside since Hammer has a base cooldown of 24 seconds. We link Heavy Swing for 35% more melee physical damage, and the downside of the decreased attack speed is barely noticeable with some decent gear and a good passive tree. Friendly reminder that more multipliers almost always outperform increased multipliers. Rage Forged is another more damage multiplier. Since we stack some rage on our jewels, we almost always have that 10 rage available. Lacerate gives 50% increased chance to bleed, which will put us at a total of 99% chance to bleed, with the 49% chance to bleed coming from the passive tree. It is better to have Hammer not bleed once every 100 attacks than spending yet another passive point to cap out bleed chance. Lastly, but most importantly, we link Exploit Weakness. This support is the reason we only want to drop our Hammer on an enemy with fully broken armor. It consumes the fully broken armor to deal 50% more damage. Infernal Cry also stays the same, with Premeditation for 15% more damage on empowered attacks, which will be the attack used after Infernal Cry. We link Enraged Warcry for 30% more damage on our empowered attacks, and Raging Cry for some additional rage sustain, and lastly Life Tap, which transfers the skill's mana cost into life, to deal with its high mana cost of 208 mana. The Stampede links are very similar, but instead of Armor Explosion, we are now using Cold Infusion support to be able to reliably chill enemies with Stampede. We use Martial Tempo for 25% more attack speed, Momentum for 40% more damage, and Aftershock for 25% added Aftershock chance. Aftershock will create a second explosion after the last instance of damage from Stampede, which is the part of the skill that deals the most damage. Unless specified otherwise, it deals the exact same amount of damage as the initial skill. The fourth support is Close Combat for 25% more damage when within 1 meter of the enemy, which works really well with Stampede as you're hugging the enemies most of the time. Lastly, we link Cold Infusion support. On top of it helping us reliably chill enemies to shatter with Pulse Circle and Ring, the 25% extra cold damage is also very welcome. If you don't have the available sockets on Stampede yet, because that pesky Perfect Jeweler's Orb just isn't dropping, replace Aftershock with Cold Infusion. Having a 5 link is the bare minimum to make Stampede feel decent though. On Shield Charge, the only link that actually matters is Ingenuity support for the cooldown reduction. You can play around with the other support gems linked here. I'm using Bludgeon to knock enemies back on hit, and Rage support for some additional rage gain. Even if very marginal, it still helps a bit. Now, for the gem that turns our warrior winter, Herald of Ice. Link it with Cold Mastery for +1 gem level. Because the +1 gem level comes from a support gem, it does not affect the attribute requirements for Herald of Ice. As a second support you want Cold Penetration to ignore 30% of the enemy's cold resistance, then Magnified Effect for 40% more area of effect, Longshot for 35% more damage on shatters, and lastly Primal Armament for 25% more cold damage. You might think Longshot is a bit of a long shot, but it really isn't. Sometimes you will shatter enemies a couple screens away, and the range of this is incredible if the pack size of the map you run allows for it to chain the shatters. Earth Shatter essentially replaces our Perfect Strike to have a backup single target damage when our hammer is on cooldown. Link it with Consecrated Effect for 40% more damage, Splinter to help break the enemy's armor, Heft for 30% more maximum physical damage, Brutality for 35% more physical damage. And this is kind of ironic since we can't deal elemental damage when linking Brutality, so that means we can't shatter with Earth Shatter. But that's fine, we use this skill for single target only. Lastly, we link Upheaval to have 3 fissures instead of 1. This is a big damage boost as their area damage can overlap. The 20% reduced attack speed can feel a bit awkward if you don't have sufficient attack speed yet. But by the time you can afford to use a perfect Jeweler's Orb on one of the least important skills in the build, you should have no problems dealing with the decreased attack speed. Our final skill gem is Ancestral Warrior Totem, a skill you can also use during the campaign at character level 52+. I did not mention it during the leveling section of this guide, because we use this skill to enhance our bleeds, and we're not using bleeds altogether during the campaign. We link it with Armor Breaker and Demolisher to help us break the armor of tanky bosses. Breaking a boss's armor quickly is necessary to get the full damage potential of Hammer of the Gods and its bleed. Font of Rage helps us with rage generation while being close to our totem, and Font of Blood adds some survivability with its 2% life regen. Feel free to weave in Ancestral Warrior Totem linked with a different skill during the campaign if you need the help. If your current Dex and Int is not enough to run the maximum level of Herald of Ice, don't worry, just use a slightly lower level one. As you gain more levels and passive points, your build flexibility goes up, and it becomes easier and easier to stack the required strength, int and dex to use everything. Around character level 90, you should have enough passive points to fully unleash the build's power.
Or just equip that stupid necklace.
Alright, that's it for the gems. Moving on to the passive tree and jewels. There's no definitive order in which to spec your passive points, but I will provide you with a guideline to follow while leveling up your warrior in the campaign. As mentioned earlier, you want to rush Resolute Technique to drop the need for accuracy. Also make sure to have Shattering Blow specced at level 41 when Stampede and Armor Explosion are available. Other than that, all you really care about in the campaign is damage, so we focus on that. Nodes that add max resistance, block chance, and of course bleed nodes are not that useful for leveling. Let's start with the Ascendancy nodes. We spec into Crushing Impacts first to help devastate proc Armor Explosion, because it helps stampede heavy stun enemies without the use of other skills. Once we unlock our second set of Ascendancy points, we spec into Earthbreaker for an additional 20% Aftershock chance. When you unlock your third set of points, unspec Crushing Blows and spec into Colossal Capacity, which is that mysterious node that adds the extra 20 inventory slots on Warrior. Next, grab Hulking Form for 50% increased effect of small passive skills. Small passive skills are all the small nodes on the passive tree wheels, so not the attribute nodes, keystones, notables, or small ascendancy passives. Hulking Form is by far the best ascendancy node for Titans, as it affects over 30 nodes on the passive tree when fully specced at level 100. For our final set of ascendancy points, we can choose between 15% more maximum life and ancestral empowerment. Which one you pick depends on your gear, level, and how often you die, I guess. If you're cruising, pick Ancestral Empowerment for more damage, and if you're struggling, pick Mysterious Lineage for the survivability. Moving on to the passive tree. Ignore the Weapon Set 1 and Weapon Set 2 passives for now, which are the red and green colored nodes. I will explain about them later. We start by grabbing the first 5 increased melee damage nodes to Path to Brutal, giving us some stun build-up, melee damage, and 10 strength. And we grab some more increased melee damage, picking up Smash, then Path to Singular Purpose for a big damage boost if you have no good leveling gear. If you do have some gear, path straight to Resolute Technique. All of the small attribute nodes go to Strength, but if you need other attributes for a piece of gear while leveling, simply respec them into Interdex as necessary. We pick up Resolute Technique and the Jewel socket, and your priority on Jewels should be to get Rage on hit. Any other beneficial stat comes after. Other good stats on rare red jewels are block chance, max fire resistance, bleed on hit, global physical damage, area of effect, melee damage, empowered attacks deal increased damage, life regen, and lastly, the least important for endgame, stun buildup. In the later levels, and once you acquire some decent gear, green jewels are my favorite, as they can roll movement speed and attack speed. This should ring a bell. These are our best in slot stats to improve Stampede, and stacking enough of it is an absolute necessity to make Warrior feel nice. In a perfect world, we would be able to roll both of these modifiers on a magic jewel. But unfortunately, magic items cannot have 2 prefix mods or 2 suffix mods. They always have 1 prefix and 1 suffix if there are 2 modifiers. Filling all jewel sockets with attack and movement speed, corrupted magic jewels, and a high roll adorned would be incredible though. Blue jewels are also an option, but the least favorite for our version of the build. If you want to do an energy shield based version, which is definitely possible at higher levels of investment, look into blue jewels. I'll cover all the unique jewels I'm using in a bit. Let's go back to the passives. After grabbing Resolute Technique, we want to go back to the start of the tree and pick up the skill speed nodes and Blood Rush. Spec into Singular Purpose and Shockwaves. If you're getting stunned all the time by meanies in the campaign, pick up the Stun Threshold and Strength Wheel. We take Vocal Empowerment next. Having our Infernal Cry empower 2 attacks instead of 1 is huge. Grab the Jewel Socket and plop a jewel in and pick up the Mace Wheel nodes after. Next we grab Crushing Verdict for another damage boost. Then spec into Armor Break nodes and pile on for 60% increased damage against enemies with fully broken armor. Pick up these AoE nodes and Aftershocks for a 40% increased Aftershock AoE. Take the Warcry cooldown recovery nodes and Admonisher for Warcry speed and more recovery. Now we path to the south side of the tree. If you're loaded and can deal with the attribute requirements, pick up Giant's Blood during the campaign and equip that juicy shield. If not, wait till we spec into the attribute wheel. Continue and grab the second Warcry cooldown recovery and speed wheel. Now we have stacked enough Warcry cooldown recovery and speed to seamlessly use our Infernal Cry in between every 2 attacks. Almost every skill we use from now on should be empowered. Grab the Jewel Socket and travel to the AoE wheel. Authority is another massive node which gives us 20% increased AoE and 10% global cooldown recovery rate. Grab another jewel socket and fill it up with a decent jewel. Then grab the jewel socket above the attribute wheel and do the same. Spec into the entire attributes wheel and try using Giant's Blood. If you're still lacking strength, you can pick up Beef for 25 strength and the strength plus reduced mana nodes. Do note that the reduced mana nodes are kind of bad once you get your hands on a weapon with plus melee skills. Outside of gems, we don't get any help with our mana sustain and pull, so crippling it is not ideal. When our Giant's Blood is up and running, we want to grab these block chance nodes and spec into Unstoppable Barrier. At this point, you should almost be done with the campaign if you're not done already, and have most of your weapon set passives unlocked. We want to start by respecking some nodes to be used with our weapon set 1. Weapon set 1 will be our clear and AoE tree, and weapon set 2 will be our single target and bossing tree. Focus on set 1 as you spend way more time clearing zones than killing bosses, even in the campaign. Respec Shockwaves, the Warcry speed and cooldown recovery nodes into weapon set 1 as well. Also respec the other Warcry wheel, and spec attack area and reverberating impact, and shield block chance and vigilance all onto weapon set 1. Grab the jewel socket with global passive points and spec into the attack speed wheel and pick up Sand in the Eyes on weapon set 1. Now we grab max lightning resistance and prism guard for 5% all resistance and plus 1% maximum all resistance. Then the max cold resistance into another jewel socket. Pick up shapeshifting and bestial rage next for a good chunk of increased attack damage. That covers all of the weapon set 1 passives and global passive skills and should give you a good idea of what to prioritize during the campaign. For the weapon set 2 passives, we want to start with all of our bleed chance on hit nodes. Make sure you grab enough of them to get to 99% bleed chance with Hammer of the Gods. Remember that you can also get 7% bleed on hit on jewels, saving you a passive point. Grab the bleed nodes below after and spec into bleeding out. Bleed magnitude seems to have several breakpoints, where having a little bit of it is not that impactful, but the moment you go over 100%, it seems to significantly increase the bleed damage. To have our bleeds deal their damage 10% faster is not that important, but we want to grab the notable to enhance it with our Against the Darkness Time Lost Diamond. We grab the final bleed chance nodes here and spec into internal bleeding. When a bleed is aggravated by aggravated bleeding, it basically doubles your bleed damage. It will treat the bleeding target as if it's always moving, and thus taking 100% increased damage. Once you've specced into all the bleed nodes on weapon set 2, check your bleed chance on Hammer of the Gods while on weapon set 2. Spec into more bleed chance nodes until you get to 99% bleed chance. Hey look, it's another jewel socket. Yep, we want that. Next, respec Crushing Verdict into weapon set 2 as well, and also pick up ailment effect nodes and lasting trauma. Gamma, now that our bleeds are up and running. Lastly, respec Pile On into Weapon Set 2. Both Weapon Set 1 and Weapon Set 2 should be fully specced out now. If you require spare passive points for more attributes or something else, you can unspec part of the top side of our passive tree. Outside of the max elemental resistance, these nodes are the least impactful for the build. I have tried many versions and variations of this build's passive tree, and after a lot of testing, I don't think I can make it much better on the current budget. The biggest upgrade would be, of course, the Astramantis Amulet, which would enable us to unspec the reduced attribute requirement nodes on the attribute wheel and the strength and reduced mana node, freeing up 3 passive points and increasing our overall damage through Jack of all trades. In addition to lowering attribute pressure on our gear, which frees up space for other mods. Another huge but extremely expensive upgrade, one we mentioned earlier, would be the Adorn Jewel and a bunch of strong corrupted magic jewels. The most important aspect of this build, and that goes for most attack builds however, is the weapon you're using. Your weapon is the root of your damage output, but more on gear and weapons in the next chapter. Now that you understand why we take the nodes we take and in which order we take them, it's time to explain the unique jewels the build is using. The first one is very simplistic. It is the Prism of Belief Diamond, which gives +3 to level of a specific skill. Stampede is our most important and most used skill, and thus we take one with +3 to Stampede. This jewel is not too expensive, selling for about 8 divines for the +3 to Stampede one. If your budget is tight, a slightly cheaper one would be the +3 to Hammer of the Gods or +3 to Herald of Ice. The second jewel is our Against the Darkness Time Lost Jewel. This jewel has a bunch of good mods that can roll on it, the most potent being 2 mods that increase attributes for all of the attribute stackers out there. But we're using one that gives us 1% increased max life per small passive skill in range and +1 max fire resistance for notable passive skills. When placing this jewel in the jewel socket above the attribute wheel, it gives us a total of 16% increased maximum life and +4% increased maximum fire resistance. This is by far the best spot to place the jewel for our Winter Warrior, as it affects the most passives in radius. Since we are using very few layers of defense, I chose to use a defensive one, but as I said, there are many options. An uncorrupted live and max fire S1 costs about 2 divines. Our third unique jewel is the Megalomaniac Diamond. This jewel lets us allocate up to 3, but usually 2 notable passive skills found anywhere on the passive tree. Almost any combination of notable passive skills can roll on it. You can imagine that certain combinations of strong notables can become very expensive. When shopping for a Megalomaniac Diamond, my advice is to use the weighted sum option on the trade website. You attach a value, the weight, to each desired notable. The better the notable, the higher you want to put the weight. The trade site will output all the combinations with your chosen notables, helping you get a cheaper one and saving you tens of searches. Understanding how to use weighted sum can be super helpful when shopping for all sorts of items, so I highly encourage you to try it out. It really isn't that complicated. You can find the weighted sum I used to buy my Megalomaniac Diamond in the video description. Most of the notables used in this weighted sum either increase attack speed, skill speed, and/or movement speed. That's all for our passive tree and jewels. Time to move on to the next chapter. Let's talk endgame gear and gear progression. Now that you have learned about the build's passive tree, how to fly through the campaign and are ready to start running maps, it might be a good idea to pick up some upgrades first. If you're playing solo self-found, well, you've signed up for the long route. Keep progressing through maps, and once you hit a wall, move back a tier and keep farming for better gear. You can find trade links for every piece of gear discussed in this video down below. I've set up trade filters to help you with your shopping. As mentioned before, the most important piece of gear for this build is your weapon. And this is actually the case for most builds, outside of stat stackers that are using Pillar of the Caged God. But I guess even for stat stackers the weapon is the most important, because Pillar pretty much enables the entire build. I bought the weapon I'm currently using early in the league for 25 divines, but its current market value sits around 100 divines. I think the reason for the absence of good maces on the market is that there are very few people crafting high-end maces, as Warrior is the least played class in Path of Exile 2. But we are about to change that, right? The most expensive mod on an endgame mace is a high rolled plus to all melee skills, with the requirement of having a decent physical DPS in addition. When this mod is left out, a similar weapon to mine so without the plus all to melee skills, would cost about 5 to 10 divines. Start with this. You can opt in for an even cheaper weapon, but this doesn't quite cut it if you want to comfortably farm juiced up maps. If you're struggling with attributes, you can also buy a mace with reduced attribute requirements on it. This mod can roll up to 35% decreased attribute requirements, which makes using Giant's Blood a breeze at the cost of a mod on your weapon. The second most important piece of gear is of course our pole circle ring. These are rather cheap, even the high rolled ones with a good corrupt on them. I'm using one with plus 11 intelligence to help out with attributes. Either use one with plus int or plus dex as a corrupt, which is the enchant type modifier on the trade website. A top tier one sells for a single divine orb. Don't go cheap here, because you will never replace this ring. For our body armor, we use a Warrior Invictus Grand Regalia, which is an amazing unique. Warriors come in many variations. I'm using one that gives plus 50% all elemental resistance and plus 25% increased maximum life with 5 soul cores socketed. I'm using maximum cold resistant soul cores, but there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to socketing your warrior. If you need more chaos resistance, use 1 or 2 soul cores of Taktaki. If you need more lightning resistance, plop in some lightning rest runes. Fit in whichever stat your character is lacking. If you're loaded and can make it work, you can even socket this with 5 soul cores of Askapa for 50% item rarity. The warrior we are using costs 4 divines for a corrupted one with 5 sockets. On shields, you are looking for a high increased block chance roll, a good life and strength roll, and the other mods should be resistances to help you get capped. Since shields are dirt cheap, try to either buy a couple and corrupt a second socket on it, or buy one with 2 sockets available already. Make sure that the block chance of your shield is at least 40%, but preferably higher. Most shields with these mods cost about half a divine. Your second ring should have a high strength roll, some resistance, flat damage, and preferably also some item rarity. Make sure to quality it with attribute modifiers. The best bases for your second ring are prismatic rings for the all res implicit and amethyst rings for the chaos res implicit. Expect to spend about 1 to 5 divines for a decent ring. On boots, a hard requirement is to have 35% movement speed. Then 2 high attribute rolls, a good mana or life roll, and additionally some item rarity. The mana roll doesn't necessarily have to be on your boots, but having at least 1 high mana mod on any piece of gear is required when using plus to all melee skill gems. If you're on a budget and can't afford a good plus to gems weapon, don't worry about the mana mod. You can also go for a high resistance roll. You'll manage to fit the puzzle pieces together. All of this information serves as a baseline that teaches you what to look for on gear. A decent pair of sneakers should cost between 1 and 3 divines. The amulet, our Timu Astramantis, is the main source of attributes on gear. We're looking for a stellar amulet with a bunch of all attributes on it. We also want a decent life roll and some more resistances. Once again, rarity is a bonus here if you can afford it. The price range of this type of amulet varies wildly. The entry search options for decent ones start at 1 divine, but if you want a great amulet, you will have to spend at least 20 divines, which is still a lot cheaper than Astramantis though. There are a bunch of good annoyance for the build. You can refer to the Megalomaniac enchants in the trade search for inspiration. A rather cheap and very strong one I'm using is Lay Siege, which gives us 1% increased damage per 1% block chance, for a total of 68% increased damage. On gloves, we are looking for yet another high strength roll, a decent chaos resistance roll to help us cap out our chaos res, a decent life roll, some flat damage, and ideally you also want a good attack speed roll on gloves, but then we are getting into mirror territory. I talked about needing 1 high flat mana roll on gear when using plus level to melee skill gems. You also want 1 leech physical attack damage as mana mod. I have this modifier on my gloves, but you can also have it on your weapon. Unfortunately, there are no similar gloves for sale at this point in time, but the trade link provided should give you plenty of options. For a single divine, you can get a really good pair of gloves. Our helmet serves as a piece of gear to fill in whatever stats the character is still missing. This can be chaos resistance, elemental resistance, maybe item rarity or attributes, or even life and mana. Given how potent it is to have at least 100% item rarity on your gear, I see that as a necessity as well. The helmet I'm using has a fat rarity roll and seems to be a one of a kind. You might want to play around with the trait filter used for the helmet, to find the right stats for your character. Expect to spend between 1 and 5 divines for a good helmet. The final piece of gear is of course our belt. I don't think it comes as a surprise this build also uses an ingenuity belt. Yeah, I know, how original, right? Even with only 1.5 rings, where the half is our pole circle ring, it is still the best in slot belt for this build. The one I am using, with 70% increased bonuses from equipped rings and a 15 strength corrupt, cost about about 17-18 divines. If this is outside of your budget, see it as an endgame upgrade. And start with a good rare belt. If you're on a tight budget, this is actually perfect because a rare belt makes it a lot easier to get enough attributes and cap out your resistances. Elemental resistance, chaos resistance, attributes, life, sound familiar, and even stun threshold are all good mods for us on rare belts. A great rare belt should not cost more than 1 or 2 divines. That should cover it for our endgame gear and gear progression. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments. And just to make sure you didn't miss the memo, you can find filtered trade links for every piece of gear discussed in this video down below in the description. Moving on to the final chapter of the build guide.
We see a winter warrior here in its natural habitat, surrounded by hundreds of hell spawns. A cinematic picture indeed. Contrary to popular belief, the more the better, thinks our warrior. While gracefully moving from pack to pack like a skipping stone of rage, our warrior hopes to find its prey. A divine being that defines its life or death, hidden between the masses.
Oops, wrong script. Right, gameplay mechanics. As discussed before, the build utilizes 2 weapon sets. We use weapon set 1 whenever clearing maps, and weapon set 2 when fighting bosses. When using Stampede, try to distance yourself enough from the monsters to not get stuck on them. The pathing on Stampede can feel a bit clunky when you start using the skill, but you will get used to the movement with time. Maps with a high stun build-up mode are not impossible for the build, but it requires some pretty good movement. Maps with minus maximum resistance and monsters penetrate elemental resistance are problematic. Another spooky mod is reduced regeneration. None of these are impossible to run, but expect to die occasionally if running maps with these mods. We can cancel Stampede's last part of the animation by dodge rolling, similar to how we cancel the animation of shield charge by dodge rolling at the very end of the animation. This can be crucial when running fully juiced up maps and in boss fights. When mapping like this, we use our Infernal Cry in between every 2 attacks to empower them. We throw down a Hammer of the Gods whenever we face a thick rare monster or delirium boss, and if Hammer doesn't straight up kill it, we can use Earth Shatter as our backup single target. When using Earth Shatter, you want to use the skill 3 times, and then use Infernal Cry to make the spikes explode. We have 3 spikes, since we're using Upheaval, and we can have a maximum of 9 spikes at a time. The explosions from these spikes can overlap for a great chunk of single target damage. 1 or 2 more Stampedes can also do the trick. To min-max our breaches, especially on maps like this one, we want to push into one direction, and once the breach monster spawns slow down, we shield charge to the other part of the screen and try to kill as many monsters there as well. When approaching a boss fight, we swap our weapon and shield from set 1 to set 2. Then we put down our totem to start building up some rage while the boss phases into action, and it assists us in breaking the boss's armor the moment it can start attacking. In addition, you can also use a leap slam for consecrated ground, giving you that juicy 5% life regen from Holy Descent. Now we use Infernal Cry and then Earth Shatter or Stampede 2 to 3 times to fully break the boss's armor, which is indicated by this red icon. When you see the icon, it is your cue to throw down the hammer. More often than not, when timed well, a single hammer is enough to kill a boss if your map is not fully juiced up to the brim. On agile bosses like this one, it can be tricky to land your hammer. You'll have to learn the skills the boss uses and its movement patterns. This is perhaps one of the most agile bosses in the game, and it can be a tough fight on melee, but it makes for a good example, so that's why I put it in. When playing the build for a bit longer and getting comfortable with the movement of Stampede, you'll start to see that you can even use Stampede to dodge a boss's attacks while dealing damage. Yeah, it's a pretty cool skill. Don't forget to use Leap Slam to close some gaps or jump over terrain on map layouts that allow it. That's it for the gameplay mechanics. We use a couple more buttons than one, but all in all it really isn't that complicated.
My ancestors!
Surely all the work I put in to make this video for you guys is worth a like and sub. And for those of you that already subbed, you're awesome. I hope this build guide encourages some of you to try out Warrior in Path of Exile 2. The class isn't quite as bad as Reddit makes it sound. In the current state of the game, with so many broken builds, Warrior barely holds up. But if you're up for the challenge, it can be extremely rewarding and fun to play. If you decide to try out the build, have fun. If anything in the video was unclear to you, do not hesitate to ask about it in the comments. And if you have some feedback, that's always welcome too. I stream almost every day on Twitch, starting around 9 PM Central European time. Feel free to come say hi sometime. The door to our community Discord is always open too, if you fancy a chat. Thank you for watching till the end, have a wonderful day, and hope to see you again next time.